So I'm very happy to sit here tonight with Mladen Dolar and Nina Power, and I'll introduce them very briefly just in a moment. I just wanted to explain that we are taking the theme of the festival, mass hypnosis, is our starting point. However, as Blaž actually already mentioned, what we will want to talk about in detail is Mark Fisher's 2009 book, Capitalist Realism, which has just been published in Slovenian. And it is available over there at that counter with special discounts tonight. And I have been informed by Maska Publishing House that actually the books are running, well, I mean, you should hurry if you want to actually get one. They are almost sold out. Any case, what is capitalist realism? This is the only thing that I wanted to say 2 words before I go and start talking to my guests. I hope you'll bear with me this moment. So Fisher describes capitalist realism as the cultural acceptance that there is absolutely no alternative to the neoliberal capitalism as it was introduced in the 1980s, late 1980s, by Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom and by Ronald Reagan in the United States. And apparently it has been accepted as the only possible paradigm. Any alternative to this sort of organization of political economy is destined to be laughed at. It's destined to be seen as a hippie kind of initiative. It will be inevitably seen as impractical, and unrealistic. So this is why Mark Fisher declares our own period as the period of capitalist realism. We have culturally, not just individually, but culturally accepted capitalism as the only viable, the only realistic possibility. So tonight to talk with me about this book and about capitalist realism are 2 extraordinary thinkers. Our guest from the United Kingdom is Nina Power, who is a writer and a philosopher. She's the author of One-Dimensional Woman, which was published in 2009, just the same year as Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, with the same publisher, Zero Books. And she's writing right now, or finishing up, the book with the following title, What Do Men Want? I think civilizations have been asking that themselves for centuries. This was always my personal question. What is it that men want, actually? Hopefully we'll get an answer from Nina at some point. And defending the home terrain, I have no idea why I'm using this boxing sort of parallel, but defending the home terrain is Mladen Dolar, one of the founders of the Ljubljana Lacanian School and a professor of philosophy in the University of Ljubljana. His recent books include Being and Its Double in Slovenian, and you can get his book published by Maska, his most recent book, Uprizarjanje konceptov, Spisje o umetnosti, is available also with a discount. And his new book, The Riskiest Moment, is forthcoming with Duke University Press. So thank you for bearing with me for this very long introduction, but let's now go straight to it. The way I figured this evening to go is both Nina and Mladen will present 10 to 15 minutes of their take on Mark Fisher and capitalist realism, and then we'll go into discussion. So Nina, do you want to start?
Sure. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation and for the introduction. It's very pleasant to leave the United Kingdom. Yeah, everybody should do it more often. And yeah, okay, so just maybe to begin by dropping my pen, perhaps, well, I mean, to say, like, I'm very pleased that Mark's book has been translated, and I think it's a mark of its relevance that it's here now, even though it's a long time after we wrote the books. And I was saying earlier to Gregor that we wrote the books when we were working together at a further education college, so we were teaching people who were 16 to 18 years old, and we wanted to write books about, you know, supposedly difficult ideas in a way that was clear and culturally relevant. And I think one of the things that Mark was always unbelievably brilliant at doing was understanding various shifts in the culture. I mean, he was really like our greatest cultural critic as well as a philosopher, if you see what I mean. And and I think since his death in 2017, everyone who read Mark, everyone who knew Mark, asks themselves what Mark would have made of any new thing, you know. So what would Mark have made of, like, the pandemic? What would Mark have made of Brexit? Whatever. It's like, you know, he becomes like this kind of ghost, as he kind of was actually in real life as well. He was always a very haunted person, as well as a very brilliant and lively person. And so Mark, in a way, sort of remains with us. And I'm pleased that his work is here and being read here as well. And I think, you know, when we think about the current situation in relation to capitalist realism, we're in a different phase, we're in a new phase of the same thing. You know, we've obviously in different places experienced in different ways the lockdowns and the bureaucratic society in full swing, the massive increase in what Mark described in this book as, quote, the interpassive simulation of participation in postmodern media, network narcissism. I think various pathologies have been like wildly encouraged by the kind of isolating and atomizing effects of the pandemic. And I think the internet is obviously a place where these often very negative forms of alienation, but also these forms of, I suppose, individual misunderstanding, devoid of relationality, are encouraged and indeed rewarded. As Mark noted, the major emotions of our period, which have replaced morality, are fear and cynicism. In the UK, in May of 2021, a member of the scientific pandemic influencer group on behaviour admitted that a year earlier the government was worried about people complying with the COVID regulations and thought that people wouldn't want to be locked down. So decisions were made by the government about how to ramp up the fear. Scientists continued, the way we have used fear is dystopian. It has definitely been ethically questionable. It's been like a weird experiment. Ultimately, it backfired because people became too scared. And I would say this is very much the situation in the UK and probably in many other countries as well, in which, again, the kind of types of anxiety, the fear of other people, of seeing others as vectors of infection, have just been exploited terribly. And I mean, we've known for a very long time, anyone who reads political philosophy has read Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. He very clearly makes the slightly paradoxical point that fear is both at the origin of civil society and the means of its preservation. And there's absolutely no way that governments don't know this. So I think this question about where fear is, how we locate fear, how we understand what it does to us individually, was something that Mark was very interested in before all of this, obviously, and we were already, of course, living in a very atomized and alienated way. Various divisions were being kind of stoked, various real forms of exploitation in the form of questions of class were being covered over by new forms of identity politics, which Mark wrote about in an essay called Exiting the Vampire Castle, which was a very controversial piece, which saw Mark very much attacked, actually, for defending the, you know, now older left position of focusing on class. And I think we have to ask ourselves a question about where we see fear, and when we're thinking about control, and when we're thinking about the kinds of populations that are being generated by the forms of politics that we are currently undergoing, we have to be very careful where we place our understanding. And I think it's of course very useful for governments if people are very divided, if they see each other as threats, This stops them from even meeting, having union meetings and so on. And I think this move towards this kind of online, purely viral life is something to be resisted at all costs. And one of the things I think that's very complicated when we're speaking about people who are dead is wanting, if you like, to put words into their mouth. And so I wouldn't want for a second to say how Mark would have understood this or, what he might have said about the pandemic. But I think in his very latest work, when he was talking about the idea of acid communism, and he was returning to ideas of thinking about the commons and thinking about questions of collective being, even in a kind of psychedelic mode. And Mark was always fiercely critical of hippiness and this idea of a kind of too simple forms of unity or celebration. He had a very punk-like antipathy towards that kind of too easy utopianism. But nevertheless, I think there was a sense in which he was trying to reconceive of those ideas. And I think the way in which the lockdown kind of operates as a sort of purely oppositional mode against those forms of collectivity, regardless, and this isn't a question about the virus, it's not a question about the reality of what that is, it's not a scientific question, it's not a medical question, it's a social and a political question about the effects of these forms of policy. And I think, when we're talking about ideas of mass hypnosis, we have to understand that fear is also being used very, very strongly as part of this. I don't know how this phrase is intended by the organisers of this festival, but I think we can, think about the way in which we are hypnotised against one another as well as sort of individually. And I think this, maybe I'll just finish on this idea of like the tension, I suppose, between a kind of a culture that celebrates and perpetuates a sort of horrible kind of party, what Walter Benjamin talks about in the fragment on Capitalism as Religion, as something like a perpetual party, that actually it's not a question of work and then leisure, but rather the fact that we're kind of trapped in a permanent carnival, like a kind of a party that will never end. So we're kind of perpetually compelled, if you like, to kind of consume and enjoy and drink and take drugs and sort of be insane without cessation, at the same time as we have this kind of incredibly depressing, alienating and atomizing and de-ritualized collective life. And I think what Mark was trying to propose, and at least this is one thing I would definitely want to suggest, is something else, which would be something like a re-enchantment of reality, which is to say a kind of reinvigoration, the question of nature, of being together in real life, and perhaps something like a destruction of the online life. And I do wonder about the younger generation who basically now spent their entire life trapped online, and whether there will be this kind of punk moment at which there will be a collective rebellion against online life in favour of a life that is collective and re-enchanted.
Well, thank you very much. I do have a daughter which was forced last year to do everything online, so I'm very sympathetic to this final question that you've raised. Mladen, you have 10 to 15 minutes.
Thank you first for the invitation. Thank you, Nina, for this. I will also start with a personal recollection. I only met Mark Fisher once. There was at the University of Newcastle a conference on radical musicology in 2007, I think. And so we shared one very happy day. It was a very fun conference at the dinner. And it was a bit of a missed encounter, not really a missed encounter because there was immediate empathy. But the thing is that he has read my book and on the voice and asked me a number of things about it, and I didn't quite know who he was. I didn't know of his blogging fame. I actually had to be somehow reminded, and actually Jody Dean told me, look, this is a person who is absolutely in command of the blogging community. This is one of the most influential people in England today. And I'm mentioning Jody Dean, who was the guest of this Indigo Festival 2 years ago, I think. And at the dinner table, there was inevitably a question of the possibility of revolution. As you know, Jody Dean, if you listen to her talk, she's the last communist standing, she would bring up this question. And Mark said basically that, of course there is possibility of revolution. Look at what the neoliberals have done in the past 20 years. This is like, they're the true Leninists today. Look, they succeed. And this line about neoliberals being the Leninists of our time is actually in the book. I mean, that was part of the sort of dinner conversation. I don't know, I jotted down some reflections, disconnected reflections on 4 different things, or 5. One on the question of what is capitalist realism, one on the question of modernism, one on the question of restoration, which also looms large in the book, one on the status of the big other, and furthermore on the question of depression. And maybe during the discussion we can somehow address all these things, not everything in one go at the beginning. So, the capitalist realism is a term which is sort of modeled on socialist realism, but socialist realism was basically a sort of a literary, artistic endeavor, a sort of view of a mission of what art should be in a socialist framework, a sort of a depiction of social reality and its antagonisms. But what is more apposite is not the current use of social realism, is this artistic, more or less, movement, but rather the idea of what was called the really existing socialism. And really existing socialism was very much around during the socialist times, and this was the slogan which was promoted by the Soviet Union, the Eastern countries, the Soviet type of Marxism, Soviet type of socialism, and by some communist parties in the West. And the slogan was intended as a critical slogan against all the socialist, communist, leftist, whatever alternatives to the Soviet kind of socialism, and the criticism that the Soviet Marxism presented of this whole kind of different other possibilities, radical alternatives on the left, was that all those alternatives are non-realist. They're driven merely by dreams and fantasies, anarchy, utopian ideas. They can't stand the test of reality, and there is a really existing socialism, which is the only kind of socialism realistically possible and really existing. So there was, in the term of really existing socialism, there was this slogan, which is in the title of the book, "There is no alternative." And it was meant as there is no alternative within the left. If there is a socialist alternative, that has to be aligned. It has to be aligned with the Soviet kind of socialism, and all other thinking is basically not realistic. The only real alternative is this, the only real alternative to capitalism. And you know that in May '68, when there was a very serious leftist upheaval in the West, the Communist Party of France did support this, precisely in the name of this, there is no alternative. So in the 80s, when Thatcher presented this, there is no alternative, there were actually 2 kinds of there is no alternatives, matching each other, confronting each other, mirroring each other. And in '91, with the downfall of socialism, they merged. They merged into only one kind of there is no alternative. And actually, Mark Fisher speaks in the book about the capitalist Stalinism. There is a sort of Stalinist undertone in this. There is no alternative. Tina, famous Tina. There is no alternative. And but the point to bring up, and the point that Mark Fisher is making, and of course, given my Lacanian background, I can't refrain from this, is the question of the Lacanian real. And this is not like bringing in my Lacanian credentials into this thing, but actually very much Mark starts from this, that the opposition to capitalist realism is the very notion of the real. So this is the conceptual basic plot of the book. The real is precisely what eludes realism, what eludes the reality principle, what is beyond both the pleasure and the reality principles and their complicity. And the aim of capitalist realism is precisely to get rid of this real. Real as a crack, as a breakdown of this reality pleasure principle, the surplus over it, and this was Lacan's immediate reading of the 68 slogan, soyons réalistes, demandons l'impossible, let's be realistic and demand the impossible. And Lacan's script was, the real is the impossible. So there is no realism of the real. And Lacan praised Marx, paradoxically perhaps, as the inventor of the symptom. I mean, the symptom, which is sort of central category in psychoanalysis. It's not Freud who invented it, it was Marx. And as the emergence of a symptom within the smooth run of this reality principle, within the smooth run of the general valorization, the quasi-universality of commodity value. And well, proletariat can be read precisely as this kind of point of symptomatic negativity that cannot be recuperated by this smooth run, while being inherently produced by this seemingly smooth run. So this is one way of putting the central problem of capitalism, and this is the way that actually this book presents it. The constant, as the capitalist realism, is a constant effort to recuperate what cannot be recuperated, to reinscribe this crack into the system of which it is the crack, to retrieve any transgression and make it work for the circuit that it transgresses, to functionalize what is not functional, to canalize the excess, to make serviceable anything that doesn't serve. And this is one of Lacan's qualifications of the real, ce qui ne sert à rien, what doesn't serve anything. The real is what doesn't serve. And capitalist realism is not simply acquiescing to the reality of capitalism as the only possible, the only game in town, but a realism which is able to integrate any real recalcitrant to it, to recuperate any excess and make it work for this realism. It's not just accepting reality, but dealing with a sort of reality which doesn't cease to transcend itself in order to perpetuate the mechanism at its core. So it's subversion which serves perpetuating what it subverts. And it's not simply reality principle, but a crazier kind of realism one has to deal with. There is a madness of this reality. Not simply reality as the check of madness. It's a realism of a mad reality. A reality is more mad than the madness opposed to it. A reality which is itself beyond the reality principle. And also there is another point which Lacan keeps making about Marx, which is the surplus enjoyment, surplus jouissance, which is carved on Marxist term of surplus value. And where the point is slightly different but similar, which is the surplus which, this is Lacan's definition of capitalism, the surplus jouissance, the surplus, what at a certain point made calculable. It is what could be counted, how to count what cannot be counted, what is in excess of every count, and hence becomes the wager of accumulation. So this is very briefly my first point about realism and the question of the real, which exceeds realism, but nevertheless the attempt of capitalist realism to reinscribe, reintegrate, refunctionalize precisely what exceeds it. And this is what makes it mad in some way. Now my second point would be about modernity and modernism. Mark Fisher was very much a man of modernism as opposed to postmodernism, and his line is that modernism contained a promise of a future that failed to emerge. Lost futures, he says. Lost futures were cancelled, they were smothered by postmodernity and neoliberalism, and there is a sort of nostalgia which sets in. And I quote from another work of his, a nostalgia for all the futures that were lost when culture's modernist impetus succumbed to the terminal temporality of postmodernity. And he uses the Hegelian word hauntology, that the ghost will come to haunt us. And well, Mark was promiscuous in his references. He has many references to Lacan, to Deleuze, to Derrida, to Zizek, to Jameson. There's a sort of very productive eclecticism at work. He uses the concepts which are productive. So there is the recurrence of lost futures, the ghosts out of time and space, haunting our present, but also kind of harbingers of opposition and hope. And well, it's difficult to delimit modernism. There's no clear-cut way of doing it. The clear-cut beginning and end. Maybe one can provisionally place its beginning in 1913. I wrote about this at some points with Duchamp making his first ready-made, with Malevich in 1913, Kafka writing the trial, Proust publishing the first book, the Schoenberg and Stravinsky. So many things happened in 1913, and the end of modernism could be perhaps handily put in 1989, which is the year of Beckett's death, the last modernist standing. And then, okay, 92, Francis Bacon, John Cage died. So modernism was understood as a promise of the future, to be then followed by this postmodern pastiche, the remake, and this temporality of the end. But let me paradoxically bring up the most prominent modernist quote by Beckett, which is the first sentence of his novel Murphy in 1938. And this famous first sentence runs, "The sun shone, having no alternative, on the nothing new." So it's a sort of emblematic pronouncement. It's a slogan that encapsulates Beckett's stance. It's his constant starting point. There are all the Mark Fisher signposts there. There is no alternative. This is what Beckett says as the first sentence of his first novel. And there is nothing new under the sun. There is no hope of novelty. So we have in Beckett's words, and Beckett is the most prominent modernist, a situation where one is completely constrained. And all his heroes start at the end, already on the first page. There's no way out. And there's another quote, "The end is in the beginning, and then you go on." This is from Beckett. So I bring this up to ask the question, how does this sentence match the postmodern neoliberal, there is no alternative? How come that Thatcher in 1980s started speaking like Beckett in like 1930s? Like Thatcher turning Beckettian. Now Beckett was bringing out the hidden truth of the state of the world already before the war, but particularly after the war. In the 50s, in the period of the greatest growth and prosperity, in the triumphant march of capitalism, so what Beckett was pointing to is a sort of bleak underside of this progress of capitalism. The bleak underside is precisely there is no alternative. There's the impossibility of breaking out of this circuit. So after the demise of modernity, this was suddenly triumphantly proclaimed. This is the point where Thatcher adopted this Beckett's adage, as it were. But Beckett's pronouncement was made in view of finding precisely a trajectory, an alternative, in the harshest of constraints, like in the situation of waiting for death, and taking this, there is no alternative, as a start of a trajectory, which is to find a way out, even in the most unlikely, way, against the bleakest of odds. So there is a sort of political lesson in Beckett, even if it seems he seems the furthest removed from political concerns, the lesson of perseverance and an opening of a future. Whereas the neoliberal, there is no alternative, is this triumphant pronouncement, which particularly asserted its validity with the downfall of Soviet alternative, and particularly when the new labor adopted its agenda. And the aim of this slogan was to deactivate any alternative. So the distance between this modernist, there is no alternative, and the sort of neoliberal one, it spans the century. And maybe it's a very economical way to encapsulate this shift. Is there an alternative? And I wish one could recuperate something of Beckett's modernist stance. Not like rushing to assert, no, there is an alternative, there is an opening, there is hope, there is future. Like seeking for the reasons for optimism and hope. But rather starting from this, there is no alternatives, everything's fucked up. And taking this as a possibility to find a way in the biggest of constraints. Can there be a Beckettian politics? Can there be a Beckettian party, as it were? Is this a contradiction in terms? And I make just maybe the third point, and I stop there, which is a point on restoration, on the question of restoration, which is the concept that Fisher briefly uses, relying on Badiou and on David Harvey. On David Harvey qualifying our time as a time of restoration and neoliberalism as the political project to re-establish the conditions for the accumulation of capital and for the renovation of the power of economic elites. And restoration, as a term, acquired its currency after the downfall of Napoleon, after the French Revolution, and everything seemed to come back to, everything was restored, come back to the normal. One should erase the historic shift that took place. So the monarchs and the aristocracy were back. The Jesuits were again ruling supreme. So let's make history reversible. And restoration lasted from the Vienna Congress in 1815 to, well, the 1848 revolution. And I'm mentioning this because of the role played by Ljubljana in this our particular place. Ljubljana was a very sleepy, dull provincial town throughout its history. It was in the backwaters, but it had its moment of glory in 1821, precisely 200 years ago, with the Ljubljana Congress. And the Ljubljana Congress was one of the very important political assemblies to re-establish the old order. So the emperors, the kings, the princes came to Ljubljana for a couple of months. Metternich came, etc., and they were trying to figure out how to crush any new rebellions by military means and how to strengthen the new alliance. And you currently have in the City Museum in Ljubljana this exhibition, The Red and the Black, which is precisely at the 200th anniversary of Ljubljana Congress. So Ljubljana was at the time the center of restoration, proudly displaying that the old powers were back, that the ancien regime was back in place. And one cannot but make a sort of ironic historical parallel, like 200 years later, Slovenia being the country currently presiding in the European Union, and sort of in a farcical sort of way, becoming a quasi-center of gatherings like the Bled Forum a month ago, gathering people like Orban, who is a frequent visitor, and Vucic and Morawiecki and Plenković. Being again the center of a kind of restoration as a grotesque footnote to 1821, a moment of historical grotesque, a sort of farce after the tragedy at this point. But I have a further point to make about restoration, because I think restoration is a sort of misnomer. And that seemingly the old forces were back in place, the bourgeois revolution was suppressed, and what actually happened during the restoration was the implementation and the normalization of capitalism, of a new order under the banner of restoring the previous state. And Balzac was the greatest writer of restoration. So the rise of the new economic relations, the new and more pervasive ways of exploitation, in this intensification of labor, massive industrialization, massive inequality. So the problem of restoration is first the return of the old order, but then secondly, and more importantly, it's not a return at all. New ways of oppression, new ways of exploitation are invented and implemented. And this is also what keeps happening with the neoliberal revolution after the demise of the hegemony of social democracy and the welfare state. So the neo doesn't mean the return to liberalism, but it's a completely new outfit, far more ruthless, far more cynical and grotesque. And restoration is like a punishment for the failure of revolutions, or even just modern reforms like those brought by the post-war consensus, of their incapacity to see through their agendas, their lack of courage and vision, not the superior power of all forces, but the symptom of the failures and the weaknesses of the left. So there we have again Ljubljana as sort of one of the centers of this false restoration, the strange new old forces of populism, of sovereignism, and the old new powers looming large. And well, I have some further thoughts on carnivalesque and the grotesque as a U-turn of the power, but maybe I stop here for this opening remarks.
All right.
And we'll use this later.
We'll try to come back to that. Mladen, thank you very much for this. So we see that you have prepared more notes to us, so we'll want to know what's there, what you've written down there. But yes, for now, thank you so much for introducing these topics. Thank both of you actually to have presented your takes on Mark Fisher's book. One thing you mentioned but then didn't talk about, Mladen, is something that I want to introduce now in the second round, which is the question of depression. Depression is something that, well, as Nina says, haunted Mark Fisher personally, but it was also something that he's written about. And when I discuss these kind of things with my students of philosophy of art, of all things, the depression seems to be something that really resonates with contemporary, people who live in the world today. Let's put it this way. At least students, but also myself and other people that I know. So I want us to talk a little bit more about depression. The thing that Mark Fisher points out so well in his book, and in other books as well, is that what has happened to us with the question of depression is that the whole question of mental health has become absolutely individualized. So if you have a depression, if you feel sad, if you feel exhausted, that's your own problem, and you are the only one responsible for finding a solution to that. So there's absolutely no social dimension to this kind of feelings that, nevertheless, we all seem to have. And Nina was mentioning the change to online classes with students, and all these other events that happened during the Corona crisis. And I think it only brought this problem further to the surface. So the depression even spread. We all know that, we've all seen the statistics that the drug abuse has really risen heavily during the past couple of years. So this is clearly a topic that needs to be addressed. So Nina, did you want to say something on this topic, more specific on what your take is? Do you still see, do you see Mark Fisher's diagnosis, if you want, as absolutely relevant or even more relevant?
Yeah, for sure. And I think some of Mark's work was in the tradition or anti-tradition, if you like, of antipsychiatry. So figures like R.D. Laing and David Cooper, who were then sort of taken up by Deleuze and Guattari and others in a particular way. And Foucault also, I mean, they did something different with it, but it was, so actually for quite a few decades, you have various thinkers and even, people who are in the medical profession, questioning the idea of somehow an individual pathology that can be separated from like a family nexus or a social condition. And, the famous R.D. Laing statement about, what is it to be sane in a mad world? In a way, it's correct to be mad. And to try to understand this as a kind of, social phenomena. And so it's not a new way of thinking about, so-called mental illness, and and I think to de-individuate it and think about social pathologies and the kinds of things that are being encouraged by a culture. So I mentioned briefly the various negative things that are being encouraged by the internet. We can all think about what those are. I mean, it's obvious in some ways. So there is already, I mean, a lot of collective thought, but I do agree that the kind of way in which mental health and mental illness is often discussed is individualizing, and those illnesses are also individuating as well in the way that they are felt. And it often takes something to break out of thinking about blaming oneself, you know, and I think this question of guilt, you know, which Nietzsche tells us is a form of debt, you know, that everybody feels this kind of, this weight of existence almost. And I think because we live more or less in a post-religious age, we lack the structures of thought that would give meaning to our suffering. You know, and even existentialist philosophy tried to make sense of suffering, you know, in this meaningless world. And after World War II, you know, it was in a way to give, you know, one gave oneself meaning by understanding one's suffering and giving it almost like a story. So I think precisely, you know, if you don't have those structures in place, all you have is bureaucracy and institutions that are somehow still making you feel guilty, but you don't have a collective way of like either expiating suffering or celebrating it. You know, I mentioned this idea of the de-ritualization of contemporary life. Like, you can get drunk and take drugs whenever you like, but it's completely de-collectivized. You know, you can sit alone in a room and get high, you know, but there's no collective ritual dimension. There's nothing enchanted about that. You know, and this is what people are doing more and more in the lockdown, you know, when basically people are imprisoned in their own heads as well as their own houses. You know, and it's not surprising. Like, I would never blame anyone for doing this, right? Like, it's not that kind of question. And but yeah, I mean, I think we have to return somehow to a general, almost like acceptance of suffering, not to say that people must put up with it, right? But to say that there is a way in which to be alive is to suffer. You know, that there is, and the best you can hope for, as Freud would say, is like everyday unhappiness. You know, but this is actually the most optimistic thing you can think, right? And capitalism always promises like a final solution, if you like, to the problem of unhappiness. It says, if you just take this pill, if you take up this form of exercise, if you, whatever, you know, consume this product, you will have the solution to your problem, right? But actually to accept, you know, and to get away from, let's say, very, very traumatic forms of unhappiness, which can be dealt with through talking with friends or by professional help, but really through talking primarily, rather than through medication, you know, other than in very extreme cases. And, you know, to have that kind of, that shared understanding that we all suffer, I think. We need to bring that back.
All right, this strangely, this rings true to me. I remember as a young man reading Nietzsche, the philosopher you mentioned is one of those interesting people. I remember this sentence, and I want to, well, I hope you will not be offended. But he says the following. Nietzsche says, man does not strive for happiness. Only Englishman does that. So, anyway, what I think he's trying to say is precisely that this whole idea that we should always be happy all the time, there's maybe something very fishy about it. So just to kind of support what you were saying. Mladen, you have several notes on depression, I think.
Yes. The question of depression is pretty much also at the center of this book. And Mark was the person. I mean, the depression was his very personal problem, which cost him his life. And I will start with the question of surplus. First is the question of surplus, and I spoke already about surplus value and neoliberalism being a new and harsh and cynical way of extracting the surplus value. I briefly mentioned Lacan coining this surplus jouissance, surplus enjoyment on Marx's surplus value. And I would continue with this surplus thing. And I think one of the diagnoses of the present moment is the amount of surplus rage which is around. There's a free-floating surplus rage. And we can witness this on Ljubljana streets with the violent demonstrations, the Wednesday demonstrations, so-called. And in a number of other places with the anti-COVID, measures, anti-COVID measures, let's say, the anti-vaxxers, etc., etc. I mean, which is an issue which canalizes at the moment this excessive rage, this surplus rage. The surplus rage which is around it can't get narrativized. I mean, it gets its narrative from, I think, these false kind of issues. And, well, I think there is this excess of rage, and there is an excess of waste, which is also sort of concomitant with this neoliberal turn towards the surplus waste, the surplus rage. And I'm somehow trying to focus on this question of surplus rage because there's an old line on depression which says depression is rage. I mean, depression is rage which gets stopped, which gets blocked, which gets stuck in the throat. It's a surplus of rage which doesn't come out as rage, but actually turns inside and completely blocks the person. And so I think there is a profound connection between this surplus rage being produced more and more by the ongoing neoliberal turn, and the surplus depression, this widespread depression, being handled by all kind of pharmaco industry, new devices, and apparently the antidepressive drugs is the most profitable part of the pharmacology at this point. I mean, this is where they make serious profits, not out of vaccines, because vaccines are kind of risky and it can backfire very easily. But antidepressants and Viagra, this is the sure sort of the sure way to make profits at this point. And of course, it resonates profoundly with the very advent of psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis emerged because Freud was treating individual patients and sort of seeing to the personal problems. But already in 1908, if not before, he wrote this famous paper called Civilized Sexual Morality and Modern Nervous Illness. So this is the point where Freud realized that, he gradually realized that the question is not the personal predicament of this individual patient. Actually, there is a social predicament conditioning any personal predicament. So there is a civilized sexual morality which is actually producing the modern nervous illness. And it's not a question of individual pathology, it's a question of a social pathology. It's a pathology at large, it's a pathology in society. And now, of course, comes the big turn, because Freud, of course, criticized this oppressive sexual morality. And somehow psychoanalysis may be said to be ruined by its own success, because it was very successful on this count. I mean, the oppressive sexual morality Freud had to deal with like 100 years ago is gone. And it was really undone. And psychoanalysis was one of the major protagonists in undoing all the classical prohibitions based on the paternal authority. And there is what followed is an age of sexual liberalization, liberty, the liberalization of sexual mores, but which brought us into even more trouble. This is the problem, that Freud at no point believed that the liberalization of sexual morals would actually get us off the hook. Of course, one should criticize the oppressive morality. There's no way of going back to that. But one should see that the liberalization in itself brings new forms of oppression. And the Freudian name for this is the superego. And the superego, the way that Lacan spelled it out, I mean, from the classical, what seemed to be classical superego injunction, like don't, prohibit, the prohibition of jouissance, prohibition of enjoyment. The Lacanian formula of the superego is enjoy, especially the injunction of enjoyment, and this is what gets us really depressed. And we live in an era of superego. The superego rules supreme.
No, I just comment on that. I mean, it reminds me very much of the latest book by Michel Houellebecq, the French novelist, who, in Serotonin, where basically it's almost like a Kantian critique of sexual reason, because So in the relation between antidepressants and Viagra, the main character, who's a typically a kind of man, a sort of middle-aged man, as well, like explores often. But either he takes he can get hard with Viagra, but not take the antidepressant. So he can get hard, but he's sad. Or he's happy, but he can't fuck, right? And this is his like dilemma throughout the whole book. It's very clever.
This is why those two things are such big sellers.
Clear alternative, very hard to choose. All right, let's move on. There's okay, climate change. This is something that I haven't. I mean, I might be wrong. I haven't read the entire opus of Mark Fisher, but I don't think he speaks about climate change specifically when he talks about capitalist realism. I hope you will agree with that. So, nevertheless, this does seem to be something that is around us. We are part of an ongoing catastrophe. This is has so far become clear. So I guess my next question would be, how does that come into play with this capitalist realism? It seems all the more obvious that the way things have been going on, at least since the 1980s, has to change quite dramatically. And that it's not going to help that we each individually separate little bottles that are brown which go there, and the bottles which are green go there, and so on. That's not going to help. We do need collective action, probably even national action and supranational action. This is what we need. I think that much should be obvious. But at the same time, we're not doing anything really about it, right? So, do we have?
I have sometimes a very paranoid thought. I like to enter into states of paranoia, and the better to think, just not get stuck in them, but to entertain various ideas. It's like a philosophical, practice. And one thing that did occur to me very early on with the lockdowns is how these are potentially going to be used in the name of the environment. I can absolutely foresee a near future in which everyone will be told to stay in, not to travel, not to use airplanes, that the elites will basically tell, working people and everyone else, not to do certain things in the name of the environment. And I would be very surprised if this doesn't happen in the next few years. So I think when we're talking about the environment, we have to be very careful about the way in which those terms and these things are also used as mechanisms of fear and guilt, and the way in which we might have a politics that is predicated on the use and abuse of those ideas of saving the planet, and the psychoanalytic understanding of Greta Thunberg's performance. I mean, this is very, very odd and disgusting in many ways, the way in which this very young-looking woman is paraded as a spectacle of the child saint telling off the important people of the world. This is a theatrical performance. It's like a scene from The Great Beauty, this Italian film, in which a young girl is basically manipulated by her parents into performing rage, actually, as a painter. So Greta is performing this particular role as this kind of angry and upset child, but there's something of the enjoyment of the elites who are watching this performance repeatedly. And Greta goes on stage and says blah 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 blah. It doesn't matter what she says, it's literally the point. Anyway, let's not talk about that. But there's something, I think we have to be very, not cynical, but I think we have to be very critical of the way in which these things, again, this has nothing to do with our individual behavior. We can all make decisions about how we relate to growth and degrowth and, what we do in our own lives, but I think we must be careful not to be manipulated by these narratives because they're serving other agendas too.
I think I completely, I think I basically agree with you. I'd say that we've already actually accepted that it's up to us to individually separate little pieces of trash in different camps. We've already transformed our way of life quite significantly. So I think that is a given. My question, I suppose, was more in the sense, nevertheless, we have already seen that when you put the action on the individuals, I mean, they will in the end they will start recycling trash, right? I mean, they will do that. But the real problems aren't addressed. I mean, like it's always the ordinary citizen that has to do something, that has to recycle or not travel or something like that. But at the same time, we see extremely wealthy people who have made extreme wealth by, destroying the earth. They're still using super expensive yachts, and they have not really paid. They're not really doing their part, is what I'm trying to say. So. Okay, you know what? I mean, unless Mladen, you have a direct comment on this, I'll go to my next point.
Well, no, I just say a couple of things. So, one is that destroying the earth is a side product. It's unintended. This excess waste, this surplus waste, is a side product of this neoliberal term in the past 50 years. I mean, first, it started earlier, but in the last 30 years, it's become really endemic. And I completely agree with the question of fear and guilt being manipulated as sort of resources of an action that one should take. And I completely agree with the point of that we shouldn't accept that it's our individual, we are guilty, it's individualizing the problem, which can only be solved at a global level and with collective action. So the more we are guilty of traveling by plane, whatever, I mean, the less we are capable of engaging in a collective action, which would really change things. But I wouldn't be so hard on Greta Thunberg, nevertheless.
My critique is not of her personally, but of the role she's playing in the spectacle. My critique is not of her.
I know, but she still has the capacity of somehow inventing good signifiers, inventing good lines, like how dare you, and I even found the line blah blah, because it's somehow, okay, we are all suddenly we're all for green politics and Green New Deal and whatever, and she says blah blah. And I think it's a very simple way to somehow diffuse the kind of very half-hearted way of doing nothing under the label of green policies.
By the way, that's actually in Mark Fisher's book. Yeah. He's talking about what if you organize a protest, but everybody shows up? What kind of protest is that? Yeah. He's talking about Bono's performances for let's get together to fight poverty, and every politician is going, yes, let's. But then of course they don't do anything. So I think it's absolutely what you're saying is absolutely in Fisher's book. Yeah, please go on.
One thing where I think is important in Greta Thunberg is that she's basically autistic. I mean, she has this autism, and people making fun of it and making this autistic child summing up, etc., etc. But I think what we need with environment is actually autistic politics, because the autists, they don't look at consequence or at the context or various forces in play or whatever. They just very mechanically pursue one thing and wouldn't be distracted from it. And there is something in this mechanical...
Are capitalists autistic then? Are capitalists autistic? They pursue one thing?
Oh, well, they always consider the context and somehow manage to engage every context in the progress. But by autistic, I just mean pursue one thing and don't be distracted by anything. I think something good precisely in this mechanical insistence and perseverance with one issue, let's do this, and coming back to it again and again and again, and showing that what we are actually doing is very half-hearted non-measures. And so I'm not so hard on Greta Thunberg. I think there's something.
It's more the people who are invited inviting her, the enjoyment of the people who are inviting her to shout
I know
back.
there's a problematic.
This is my
I know there's a problematic.
Yeah.
Of course.
All right. Thank you both. So maybe we should open this up to questions from the audience. So how shall we do this? We have just microphones here. So let's say that if you have a question, you should raise your hand, and then we'll try to get a mic to you. There's a hand over there. So can you just please walk all this way, so make a little bit of a parade and just... Oh, you do have a microphone. That's great.
But I'm not working.
Please, try to be succinct and clear, and you can even pose it in Slovenian if that's easier. We don't see very well because we're blinded by lights, so we're just guessing that something is going on over there.
I don't know, there's nothing going on.
Oh, I see. So this was just a person saying there is a mic. Okay, good. But no question, just an answer. There is a mic. So yes, we have a question right here in the first row. So maybe we can get the mic towards the first row. Somehow, yeah, just here in the first row. We have a question. Yes, we'll get it there.
Yes, I have a question regarding the last topic, where there is needed a collective action to solve an environmental crisis. But the question is collective action possible without individual action? Because now we are like everybody, we are trying to, each individual is trying to do something, but something as a collective is needed. But can the collective action happen without individual action first?
Okay, thank you very much. Who wants to respond to this? Is there a way for a collective action to function without an individual action?
I think there's quite a step from being called upon as individuals to do our bit and to separate the garbage and not judge by blame or whatever, which is still premised on we are individually guilty of this massive havoc that has happened with the environment, and there is quite a step from this to the collective. Defining collective goals and making a collective organization and defining the precise measures that should be taken and that cannot be taken by individuals at all. Because the magnitude of the problem is such that it's not an individual problem. And of course, well, yes, we have to take part, we have to individually take part, but there's a difference of level of what one can individually do and what should be done, which is so massive that actually transcends any one particular country and can only be solved on a global level. And global action will have to be taken at some point. And this global action actually goes beyond the neoliberal consensus which is ruling today. And this is why the ecological problem is something which is going very probably, very shortly, disrupt this consensus.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's maybe this question of waste. I mean, I think we live in a world that has mass-produced billions of unnecessary things, and I think there is no way that if it's as bad as the scientists say, that anything like this can continue. I think it's just going to be a question on whose terms does it continue in which way, right? It's, you know, and I think that if we're looking at a kind of neo-feudal serf state in which the elites can carry on doing what they want and everyone else has to be dispossessed of everything, then this is perhaps not the right way to go. I'm much more interested in ideas of degrowth, which would be basically, you know, slowly returning to forms of sustainable living on a mass scale that wouldn't involve the rapid dispossession of everybody by a small number of people. I don't know why I'm laughing, it's absolutely horrific. But I think it might be a question of reconceiving also the question of the relationship between the individual and the collective, right? I mean, in a weird way, like Marx, for example, in the German ideology says we don't yet know what it is to be an individual. Like we actually have a very, very narrow, imposed conception of what it is to be an individual human, which is to say all of our various capacities and talents are basically restricted and narrowed by forms of capitalist oppression and the way in which we are funneled into particular pathways. And Paulo Vino would say actually we're now being exploited at the level of our capacities as such. So our way of speaking, our way of being social. Anyway, so the question of the individual and the collective, I think, needs to be posed at a kind of philosophical, political level before even we get to these questions of guilt and so on in individual practice, which are nevertheless, of course, extremely relevant. And of course, I don't think that random collective actions they clearly aren't solutions in themselves. They're more symbolic usually. I'm not, against those. I think, but it's very obvious. I think that there is too much stuff in the world. Like we don't need this stuff, and there are other ways of living which are maybe actually much more gentle. And I think probably we should stop making computers and phones and just sort of hang out in the park more and grow some carrots.
Thank you for that. I'm actually sympathetic to farming, but you were mentioning dispossessing so much that I'm absolutely reminded of a thing that happened quite recently in Berlin. Many of you know this, that there were like general elections in Germany, but Berlin did something crazy. So the municipality of Berlin, like the people of Berlin, decided on a referendum that they want to dispossess, or as they put it, enteignen, they want to dispossess legal entities, basically financial trusts that are only interested in profit. They want to dispossess legal entities who own more than 3,000 apartments in Berlin. So Berlin is heavily under gentrification for the past decade or more, and so they decided that, well, Enteignung, dispossession. So I was just wondering, since the title of our talk is there no alternative? Maybe there is. Maybe we should, maybe Enteignung is one of those options that haven't really been tested yet. Do you guys agree with me?
Well, yeah, I suppose as I said, it depends on whose terms, right? It's like if the elites tell everyone else that they're not allowed any stuff, right? That's very bad. So
that's already happening. I think
yeah,
that's already happening.
So I think dispossession would have to be. Yeah, I mean, look, I think we're fundamentally lacking creatures, like as creatures of language, as fundamentally, whether we're Hegelian or Lacanian, however we want to stand ourselves. Like
these are the only alternatives, just so we know.
So
you could be a Hegelian, you could be a Lacanian.
No, that's sort of similar enough, right? So basically, we have to understand that we're all collectively lacking creatures, right? Like that we all lack something. And, or lack everything. But this is actually also a form of our collective being, is the fact that we all share a lack, And that this is actually a form of solidarity that is not based on who we are exactly, like other than this very fundamental absence or lack that we will share, right? It's a very interesting starting point. And so I think if we do start from this idea of lack, then we can also reconceive the world in this way. What is it that we actually need, not what we want? For example, capitalism famously blurs the difference between need and want and creates new wants, such that you, as I said, you come to think that something will solve the problem. Like you'll find something once and for all that will solve the problem. Whether it's a product or a supplement or a person, you start to think of people as commodities and solutions to your problem. But your problem is never going away, right? Everybody has the same problem.
Okay. Thank you, Nina. So let's allow one more question from the audience. There's a hand over there in the fourth row over there.
Hi. Oh, this is working. So this might actually be a question more like targeted at Nina, at least initially, since I guess I found out about her through IndieThinkers. But since we're talking about capitalist realism and alternatives, how do you view these attempts to sort of start these kind of post-academic institutions in the context of capitalist realism, I guess?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I should just basically say, so I used to teach in the university in the UK for 13 years, and I left, partly because I just couldn't handle the level of bureaucracy anymore and the kind of forms of ridiculous meetings and form filling, and I just had this moment of rebellion, and I left on a whim. On a day, I just said I can't do this anymore, and I left. And yeah, I mean, I was also having a midlife crisis, I'm also a bit mental, and it's fine. But it was good, it was actually a very good move. Because one of the things that me and various other people were thinking about was actually how to get back to the reason why we were in the academy in the first place, which is because we were very interested in ideas, and we wanted to discuss them. And precisely, I suppose, a lot of the thinkers that weren't then being discussed in the academy, like who were basically being excluded for various reasons, political or otherwise, we wanted to talk about them, and we wanted to directly talk about them with the people who were also interested in them. So I'm very influenced by Ivan Illich, who's a kind of renegade Catholic priest, who's a very, very interesting thinker who did a kind of critique of various institutions, including medicine, and his most famous book is Deschooling Society. He also talks about gender. He was cancelled for talking about gender in 1982, way before everyone else was. And he's a fascinating figure, and he's not really covered, for example, in the institution partly because he's a critic of institutions, possibly. He might be a little bit studied in education studies, maybe, but he. So yeah, me and some other people decided to set up these other platforms, and Illich talks about learning networks. He basically predicts in the 70s the possibility of people being able to link up with each other on the basis of a shared interest to pursue these discussions. And in a way, one of the positive things about the internet, although I'm obviously very critical of it, is precisely it permits this. So I can speak to people in, I don't know, all over the world, basically, which is what happens. And we arrange a time that is suitable for everyone. Sometimes it's like 2 a.m. for some people in Australia, but they're okay with it. And we discuss these texts. And of course, there's no certificate, there's no, like, it doesn't get you any status, but it is purely on this basis of enthusiasm and enjoyment, and I think a lot of people are doing this now. And of course, I don't have very much money, but like, who cares? I have a much better life than I did before.
Very good. Mladen, did you want to comment as well?
Yes, well, very briefly. First, post-academic, this sounds good to me. Both Gregor and me were part of a post-academic institute at some point in the Netherlands called Ljubljana, and it was a really sort of utopian kind of gathering there where nobody cared about certificates but could engage in serious research. But now, I don't think that it's quite an alternative either to leave academia and do an alternative sort of network or work within academia. I think both things should be pursued. I think one shouldn't give up in universities just by getting out, but try to force the universities to fulfill the role they were intended to fulfill. So go back to the so-called academic standards, because what we have been witnessing in the past 50 years is actually the disintegration, the growth of university, the growth of universal education, the availability of university to everyone. I mean, to such an extent that it was never the case in history. In Slovenia, like 70% of a generation ends up in university education, but which actually, the price for this was sort of dwindling of academic standards and dissecting knowledge into marketable sort of slices. And I think university cannot be simply abandoned to this sad fact. And there is a fight to be done for the role, the enlightenment role of university within the university itself. And this goes in parallel with establishing alternative networks, which I'm also doing all the time, sort of gathering, connecting people which are completely regardless of their academic positions and goals.
I don't in principle disagree with you, but I think the situation in the UK, for example, like we lost the battle, you know, to keep the universities free or cheap, you know, like my students were graduating with £50,000 worth of debt. I felt guilty for participating in a system that felt profoundly unethical because, you know, these were working class students who were basically screwed for getting like a 2-1 degree in philosophy from a not very highly ranked university with this level of debt. You know, like I couldn't, in good conscience, continue like participating in that system. You know, there are many reasons why I left, but this was one of them. And I think, you know, what happens when you create a system that is basically like students are buying a degree, like that you literally create consumers. You're not able to judge them anymore. There is no criteria for assessment. You know, literally people, and it's not the student's fault. You know, because the university are literally telling them that they are consumers, they're clients. And so there is no principle of judgment, there's no discernment, we have to pass everybody. If students don't like a lecturer, they campaign to get them fired because they're buying a product, you know, and it's so far advanced that the thing you're talking about, it would take so long to get back to this principle of standards and judgment and critique, I think.
There is just pointing that in this book, Mark Fisher really goes into discussing all these topics that Nina was mentioning, analyzes UK situation in higher learning. So one more question, and then we should really start. Apparently there's going to be a party afterwards. So yes, there's a question right over there. I see you now. Sorry that you had to wait so long. I'm just blinded by the light.
Hi, I have a question for Nina Power. You, about politicizing depression. You mentioned that actually there's an emancipatory force in depression and happiness, and it could be used politically against capitalism. And Professor Dolar actually mentioned that there's a similarity between the anger and the depression. So the protests that are happening here in Ljubljana, the anti-vaccine thing, would you say we should endorse it as a way of fighting capitalism? Because that's the consequence, I think, of what you're saying.
Okay, let's be clear on this point. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, in this sense I'm a classical liberal. I think that everyone has the right to protest. I used to work for a campaign called Defend the Right to Protest. I think there is like enormous hypocrisy in the UK, for example, over the Black Lives Matter protests and the anti-vax protests, in which one protest was good and the other was bad. And I think the demonisation of the people who are protesting against the lockdown has also other dimensions which need to be understood and analysed, because it's often to do with class, which is something that is becoming harder and harder to talk about, because politics has become fragmented into questions of identity and tribalism. So I am not against people protesting if they feel moved to protest, for example, against the lockdowns. And I think often people are miscategorized in terms of their perfectly legitimate concerns about things that are not being explained to them. As I said in my opening remarks, the government has admitted in the UK that it absolutely manipulated the population to make them so afraid that they would over-conform to the regulations. And I don't think this is a way to treat people. I think this is to betray the reason that we all possess. And I think other countries like Sweden, for example, behaved in a much more rational way with their population. And so I'm very opposed to a politics of fear. And so I can understand why people would react with fear and with anger against those people that they don't trust. So I'm not against these protests at all.
Yes, well, I briefly addressed this already. I mean, the excessive range which is around, the excessive range, the surplus of range, which I think is a very dangerous thing at the moment. It's a very explosive thing at the moment. And I already briefly addressed that I think that the anti-vaccine movement, which has a lot of energy, is a sort of condensation or displacement of all kinds of problems. It's not about pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine simply. It's one way that this excessive rage is being canalized. I agree with you that we shouldn't treat simply the protesters with whom I don't agree basically as a rebel, somehow inferior human beings who don't see light. This is a sure way to exacerbate this kind of conflict, which I think is not a good kind of conflict. And I think a lot should be done to sort of keep the common ground of, let's say, in psychoanalytic terms, of the big other, in which we can sort of argue. They can argue, we can argue, keep the common ground, and not to look at each other as half-wits, not worthy of the discussion. And I think keeping this dialogue and trying by that public argument, we are still in the Enlightenment, sort of public use of reason, kind of basic framework. Keeping out that argument, hopefully the surplus rage can be canalized in a better way, because at this moment the populism is canalizing an excessive rage, and this is, I think, the dangerous. This is where Trump was possible, precisely because a certain democratic mainstream policies actually were completely underestimating the kind of rage that was accumulating. And it was accumulating already because of the 2008 crisis, which was then the state sort of filtered in trillions of dollars in order to save private companies. And this was shuffled on the shoulders of the working class, basically. And this is one of the major triggers. There are several triggers, but one of the major triggers is precisely this. The excessive rage was there, and this is a big political question at the moment. Who will be able to sort of address, canalize, and how to use this excessive rage for a policy of change, and not for a policy which maintains actually the basic assets of the situation, which produced this rage in the first place.
Right, thank you. We've been discussing Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, this book, which you can get over there for an amazing discount. This was a talk organized by Indigo Festival and Maska Publishing House. And we have been Mladen Dolar, Nina Power, and Gregor Moder. Thank you very much.